our Bible study. We're in week number 20 of this study. We're looking at Romans chapter 7. As we talk about every week when we open one of these up, Romans is one big thought, and it's important that we always put ourselves back in the train of thought. So if this is your first time on one of our studies, after this, go back and start at the beginning of this playlist of videos and work your way all the way up, because it's important that you see Romans as a bigger picture than just whatever we're zoomed in on this week, because this Bible study does get pretty zoomed in. Last week, last 2 weeks, we've started chapters 6 through 8. And 6 through 8 are, in my opinion, like kind of one of the peaks, if not the peak, of New Testament writing. Like, it is so dense. It illustrates the point of the gospel on a significant way. It encapsulates pretty much everything that the entire New Testament is trying to teach. Now, there are big things missing from it, obviously. That's why we have the rest of the New Testament. But chapters 6 through 8 kind of just, they spell out like the point, the purpose, the why of Jesus. And to do that, Paul, or the author, he uses the Exodus story. Essentially, he takes the Exodus story from the book of Exodus, Moses leading the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, through the Red Sea, through the wilderness, to the Promised Land. And he co-opts those ideas, he shows how Jesus has done the same thing on a much bigger scale. He says that he equates baptism as the passing through the Red Sea. The Israelites were saved through water. We are saved through water. Egypt, where the Israelites were enslaved to sin, or were enslaved, we were enslaved to sin. The Promised Land that they are led to, freedom, we're free from sin and death. And so last week, Paul made things confusing, right? Last section, Paul said, hey, you're no longer slaves to sin and death. You're now slaves to God. And that is very, he even says in verse 19 of chapter 6, this is not the best. This is confusing, but I'm using things that you are familiar with, so you understand, because the whole point was, a slave is limited by their master's will. Whatever their master says they're allowed to do or not allowed to do, that's the limitations on them. And his point was, well, sin as a master, it works you to death. You are going to work your whole life until you're dead, basically. And that doesn't mean the literal death that we think of, everybody dies at the end. No, I'm talking about the death of spirit, the death of everything good. That's what sin does. It corrupts the good that God has created. And so if sin, Paul says, is your master, well, it's going to work you to a place where it only leads to death. Whereas if God is your master, well, you're going to get life. Your reward, your wages, what you earn, he says at the very end, verse 23, the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. That if you live within the constraints of what God says, then that only leads to life. And it's an important thing that we recognize as we grow as Christians, because it's easy to think that all we have to do is believe. And I've preached on this and taught on this a lot lately, and I don't know why. It's just kind of everything's lining up at once. But it is this idea of cheap grace, that you just pray a prayer, you believe, and you're good. And it's belief plays a part in this, for sure. You have to believe essential things, but that's not it. That's not all of it. That you still have things that you're called to do. You have things that you are forbid from doing. And it's not because it's some big party pooper thing, or, God's up there wanting to ruin all your fun. No, he's no, those things lead to death. There's a better way. That's the whole point of the law, which Paul will get to after this section. That the whole point of the law was to teach you, hey, things in this world that sin is corrupted, they only lead to one thing. And so today's section, we're going to be in chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, and Paul's going to use another illustration, try to explain this idea that working under the law only produces one thing. It only leads you to sin and to death, whereas under grace, under Jesus, it only produces life. And we are obligated to both, right? And so he's going to use another illustration to do that. So let's go ahead and read this section, and we'll break it down. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 7, it says, "Surely you know, my dear family, I am after all talking to people who know the law, that the law rules a person as long as that person is alive. The law binds a married woman to her husband during his lifetime, but if he dies, she is free from the law as regards to her husband. So then she will be called an adulteress if she goes with another man while her husband is alive. But if the husband dies, she's free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress if she goes with another man. In the same way, my dear family, you too died to the law through the body of the Messiah, so that you could belong to someone else, to the one who was raised from the dead, in fact, so that we could bear fruit to God. For when we were living a mortal human life, the passions of sin, which were through the law, were at work in our limbs and organs, causing us to bear fruit for death. But now we have been cut loose from the law. We have died to the thing in which we were held tightly. The aim is that we should now be enslaved in the new life of the Spirit, not in the old life of the letter. A while back, I saw an interview, and I know no context about this interview. I don't know who the people were doing it. I don't know who the person was being interviewed, but it was one of those things that I saw, and it stuck with me. Like it just, I think about it kind of regularly because it was so shocking. So the interview was with this old woman, and by old I mean somebody we would all consider old. You know, she was probably in her late 80s. Like this lady was quite old. And she was asked the question. She said, "What is the most pivotal moment in your life? What is the most shocking thing, the thing that changed your life more than anything? What was the most pivotal moment in your life?" And this lady, she's sitting there, she's in her chair, she's got all bundled up. She looks like this very sweet old lady. And she says, "Well, probably the plane crash." And the interviewer goes, "Oh, what do you mean a plane crash? You were in a plane crash? Oh my gosh!" And the lady's like, "Well, no, I wasn't in a plane crash." She said, "Well, I was married and I fell in love with another man. And he was my beloved, and I wanted to be with my beloved, but I was married to this other man. I desperately wanted to find a way to be with my beloved. And I was depressed, I was miserable. And then one day I got a phone call saying my husband was in a plane crash and died, and I jumped for joy. And then I married my beloved and have been with him the rest of my life until he passed away." And it was like, after hearing her answer, hearing that come out of like, this sweet little old lady, like it was like, I don't think that moral compass maybe points north, maybe. But it stuck with me. It was shocking. Like, the most pivotal moment in her life, the thing that brought her the most joy, was when her first husband died because she didn't want to be married to him anymore. Now, leaving room for caveats. Maybe he was abusive, her husband. Maybe he hated her. Maybe, I don't know. I leaving caveats for any of that. It wasn't explained in the interview. It was a really short interview. So I don't know any context. And if you find it, maybe you know more. I don't know. But I know that, like, number one, it was like she was just glad her husband died so she could marry some other dude, which, that's messed up. But also, it illustrates today's point pretty well. The Bible, it uses marriage a lot, mostly because of Paul, but Jesus also did as well. It discusses the relationship between God and us as similar to a bride and a groom. And it's important that we understand that context. It's like if we think of God as a man, as a male gender, it's because that's easiest for us to understand, right? Like it's important that people realize that God is not male or female. He's neither, because we're both genders created in his image. He simply reached into society, reached into culture, and when he communicated with us, he did it in a way that would allow us to understand him and understand how we're supposed to approach him. Because if he simply presented himself as a spirit being that has unlimited power, and then you may not know how to address that, but you know how to address a dad, or most of us do. Maybe you had a bad dad. That's really common. But the thing is, like, that's the way God presented himself to us so that we could understand how to be in relationship with him. The Lord's Prayer talks about, and it originally was given in Aramaic, and "Our Father, thou art in heaven." That's the multiple translations of language. Jesus said it in Aramaic. It was translated to Greek, which was then translated to English. Like, it was daddy. Like, you know what I mean? Like it was very informal, Aramaic daddy. So my point here is that when the Bible speaks of our relationship to God in terms of a marriage, it's not saying that we're literally married to him, but it's to understand the way it's supposed to work. And marriage worked a little differently back amongst the Jews in the first century. And it worked, it was a lot more serious, but also wasn't. See, if you read parts of the Gospels, Jesus gets asked about marriage a lot because it was the heartbeat of that culture was to have sons. Like that was a tribal culture. If you go to that part of the world today, it's still very, very prevalent that people wanted sons because sons carried on the name, sons carried on the history, carried on everything. Like to have a son was the heartbeat of every man and woman. They wanted to have sons, and so for that to happen, it was supposed to be through marriage, right? And marriage was entered into very seriously. It wasn't about love. It was about producing sons, producing heirs. And so if you were a woman, that was, for the most part, again, there's exceptions to every rule, but for the most part, everybody in this society who was from a Jewish background, they would have wanted kids above all else. And most Greek and Roman and pagan women would have as well. But for sure, the Jewish aspect, they wanted to have sons. And so there were lots of rituals built into it. There were lots of rules. There were a lot of regulations. I mean, if you think of the Christmas story about Joseph wanting to divorce his Mary, like there was so many different elements to this that it was a very complicated thing, but it was also extremely powerful. And that's why Jesus and here Paul use this as an illustration for our relationship to God. And I say all that to say that the point of a marriage, again, is to bear sons. What Paul is getting at here, he says, like, listen, when we were married to the law of Moses, we were obligated to certain things. We were obligated to bear its children, right? James uses this illustration when he talks about sin, that sin, when it's conceived, it grows, it gives birth, and then ultimately sin gives birth to death. You know, he's talking about the same thing. That when we were married to the law, when the law was our husband, we were obligated to it. Now, let me just hit the pause button there for a second. You have to put yourself back in a first century Jewish worldview to understand this. A woman, which, sorry, like, if that offends you, but like, the church is always the woman in the marriage illustrations in the Bible. We're always the bride of Christ, right? So we are subservient to the groom, because that's the way the first century marriages worked, that the man was very clearly the one who made the decisions. He was the head of the household. He was the person in charge in this relationship, and their household was managed almost like a business. I mean, marriage wasn't about love. It was about producing sons so that their family could continue on. So it's important that when we look at this and it says that we were married to the law, we are the bride, and the law was the person making the decisions for us. We are obligated to do those things. And ultimately, the only thing that we would produce from that marriage would be sin and death. That's Paul's point. He says, as long as we were tied to that husband, we only could bring forth the fruit of death. He says, but the way out of a marriage was through death, right? He says the only way that somebody can marry somebody else is if they died, if the other person died. And he says that through Jesus, through the cross, we died to the law, that we were set free from its shackles, that we are now the bride of Christ. And yes, he still is the one who makes the decisions. He is still the head of our household, but we only bear the fruit of life in this relationship, in this marriage. Right? That's his whole point here, is that we have to remember that we are no longer tied to the law. We are no longer obligated to bear the fruit of death, but instead we are tied to Jesus and we bear the fruit of life. You know, it's basically the same illustration as a tree. We bear fruit. It's just which one are you tied to? And Paul's point here is that we have to remember that through the Messiah, our old marriage was put to death. Not that the law was killed, but it was fulfilled, right? It's important that we use that terminology because the law has a point. And And especially if you read in the book of Acts and you see where the Jewish worldview was and their stance, like this wasn't Paul saying you were not allowed to keep the law anymore, because as we studied last Sunday, there were a lot of Jewish Christians, Messianic Christians, who did continue to keep the law, but who were saved by grace. So the point here that we have to remember is that we do have a new husband, right? That we are the bride of Christ. The church is the bride of Christ, and we are called to do as he commands. Again, this is the first century worldview of marriage. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind as we go about our lives, that we remember we are called to bear good fruit, that we are called to raise up works of righteousness. Not that that earns us anything, but that it's we are called to do. Hopefully this helps you as you continue on your journey in Romans and helps you in your faith. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, see you next time.